All right, so we can just kind of jump into this. Obviously, we don't typically do lives on Thursdays at noon, but we, as the kind of water quality experts in this space, we just felt like it was really necessary to discuss this breaking news that's happening with a analytical lab in Canada. I'm going to let Eric really take the lead on this because he's much more well suited to address it than I am. But essentially, there is a legal dispute that's going on regarding this company in Canada that produces the analytical standard for PFAS. And we talk about PFAS all the time on our channel, and we have tons of information on our blog and stuff. And we actually did an Instagram live yesterday that went really, really in depth into what PFAS are. In short, it's a cancer-causing chemical that is being found in drinking water across the entire country. It's an ingredient in firefighting foam, like non-stick fabrics.
Oh, they're everywhere. They're used everywhere. I mean, your Whole Foods, salad bar box has PFAS on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So and this manufacturer of PFAS called Solvay is actually challenging this lab's ability to sell the analytical standard for PFAS. So while this may seem kind of, in the weeds, Eric is going to break it down for us and talk about some of the implications for, what this means. So Eric, if you actually just want to introduce yourself, maybe talk about why you're equipped to answer this, then we can get right into some of the questions that I have for you.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Eric Roy. I'm chief scientist at Hydroviv, and I guess I'm kind of equipped to talk about this because in my R&D days, I used to develop methods and standards for regulated chemicals or chemicals that could be regulated. So I've seen kind of the tactics that, I've seen just both foundationally, like how this all plays out. And I've also seen kind of the steps that people that don't want these things to move forward, I've seen a lot of the tactics that they do. Like you said, this is really, really in the weeds. So I'm going to be curious to see if we can pull this off and make this interesting. Because, if you want to distill this down to the most fundamental level and summarize it in a sentence, it's basically, if you can't measure something, you can't regulate it. All right?
Yeah.
So what an analytical standard is it's basically this sample that laboratories use to calibrate their instruments. And these standards are incredibly important because it ensures the quality and that the purity and all the quantitative stuff has a solid foundational base. Okay, so it's like, imagine, and just like a real world scenario that I think we've all kind of like at least feared if you drive is like, if you're just driving down a road and your speedometer says you're doing 45 miles an hour, it's 45 miles an hour, you get pulled over by a cop and they say that you're doing 120 miles an hour. And you're like, I was not doing 120 miles an hour. They're like, well, my speed gun says you did. The way that would play out in court is you would see when it's calibrated, and then there would be some sort of objective standard that would be used to ensure that that measurement was correct. Of course, if you have a defense attorney, they'll be like, this wasn't calibrated correctly, therefore we need to throw this out. What we're talking about today is like the nerdiest water quality equivalent of like an uncalibrated radar gun, okay? Because it's not even the radar gun we're talking about, it's the thing that they use to calibrate the radar gun. But it all just kind of boils down to this idea that if you can't measure something accurately, reproducibly, and reliably, and different labs can't get the same answer for the same sample, you cannot regulate that chemical. So it's my understanding that the company that's taking action against this lab, they used to supply an analytical standard for one of their proprietary chemicals. Is that correct, Analies?
I believe so.
Yeah. So it's like their patent covers the manufacture of this chemical, more than likely, because it's proprietary. And what they're arguing is, oh, we're just going to stop making this available, and we're not going to let anyone else make it. because it's covered by our patent. And that is what that means, is that anyone who wants to make measurements in an academic environment, so like let's say you're a professor at wherever, and you're like, oh, I'd like to make a measurement of this chemical to see if we can track contamination and stuff. It means that you're mixing your own standards maybe, or you're trying to figure out how to like get an accurate measurement. And what it does, it gives the potential polluter.
Oh, did we lose him? Oh, yep, you're back.
Am I back? All right. And without an analytical standard, you can't actually trust those measurements. That's the argument that people will make, which talk about killing progress on tracking PFAS and stuff like that. I mean, this is really, really important because it just gives people an opportunity to be like, you need to throw out all these data because this calibration standard was not up to snuff. And it's like,
yeah. So let's just kind of talk about why this would benefit Solvay, or like this one company that's saying, no one else can make this analytical standard. So let's just talk about why it's a good thing for them.
Oh, this is a really good thing for them because it allows them to inject uncertainty in any measurement that is pointed at their regulated proprietary chemical. And by, they can be like, okay, well, how did you calibrate your instrument? I think the general public is kind of conditioned with like CSI and stuff like that to think that the way that an analytical lab works is like there's scientists that just kind of like, they're wearing the goggles with their arms crossed, looking at this giant like glass monitor, and then there's like graphics that pop up and out comes the number. That's not how it is at all. I mean, it's just this meticulous, painstakingly accurate like documentation process. And if you throw a wrench into that, everything that happens downstream of that wrench in that process, you can throw into question. So it's this tool to inject uncertainty. And it's a valid tool, because standardization is important, because if that standard is not accurate, you really can't trust any measurements that were calibrated using it. I mean, it's a real concern.
Yeah. All right, let's see what else we have for questions here. So you kind of touched on this, but I think it's important because so many university labs are doing a lot of research on PFAS right now. Like we know, for example, Duke and NC State are two labs that we've worked with.
Oh, and Michigan, like a ton of universities are measuring PFAS.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in part, it's because, they typically have more resources and more flexibility than, say, EPA, which might be surprising to people, to be able to study these chemicals. So what are the implications for university labs that need this analytical standard? You kind of touched on it, but I think in terms of universities, it'd be good to kind of talk about that. That's a really good question. So it's really important that we understand, and we just mention a little bit of backdrop about the role that universities play in science in general. Universities typically do what's called basic research, and by basic research we do not mean easy or like downgraded. It's just fundamental research, and it's exploratory and it's experimental, and you can change things. And then basically, like, when you take a tentative R&D method and you look to standardize it so you can use it for regulatory measurements, there's a process to do so. Okay, so understanding that universities kind of live in this exploratory space a lot of the time, and then it's like they pass off their learnings to regulatory agencies, nonprofits, and things like that. Yep. So and then eventually maybe it turns into a regulatory framework, right? So universities are kind of like the foundation of this. But you could imagine that if you're a university professor or working in an academic environment, I've worked in them, and you don't have access to something that is a certain concentration, that means that when you measure a water sample and someone else measures that same water sample, you're going to get different results. And we've seen this at Hydroviv because
back in our early days, we were using universities for a lot of our measurements, and we were having a really, really hard time getting reproducible data. So it's like we take the same water sample, split it between bottles, send it to a bunch of different labs, some universities, some contract. Some of them are using different methods, and the numbers that you get back, like if we just pretend it's 100 parts per trillion, we would see measurements ranging from like 25 parts per trillion to 400 parts per trillion for the same water sample. And that's because there's a lack of standardization. So again, it just goes back to like, it's super boring and super in the weeds, but if you can't have confidence in your calibration curve, the measurements that you use, like that use that calibration, it's really, really difficult. And if you're in an academic environment and you're trying to collaborate with other labs and you're using different methods, sometimes that can lead to apples to oranges data comparison. So it's, you know, it's kind of one of these things that we really like to standardize.
Yeah. And I think like the word of like throwing uncertainty into all of this is, it's really harmful to the public actually, because
well,
you know,
it can be.
Yeah, if you're being told one thing, and there's no standard, you know, you might not know the actual number. But
it's really important to get the number right too. So I mean, it's injecting uncertainty, but it's also raising a valid concern, right? So if these measurements, if you're measuring water and you're saying, hey, it has 100 parts per trillion PFOA, but you're not using a certified standard for PFOA, that's tough, right? So I mean, that's a valid concern, but it's also a tool that can be used by people that maybe don't have the same altruistic intent, if you want to put it that way. And I've seen that in previous lives, like with, let's put it this way, it's something that's used.
Yeah. Well, I think that those are all of the questions that I have. We wanted to kind of keep this kind of brief, but yeah, I think this is a really important thing, and we obviously care a lot about PFAS, and we care about like the progress of PFAS becoming regulated and people just understanding more about this chemical. And this is a really, really significant roadblock, and I think it's important that all of our viewers and listeners really understand that this is really putting a damper on the progress that has already been made. So
we are pro PFAS regulation, and again, like anything that can be used to erode that foundation, you know, that research foundation that regulatory methods can kind of stand on, anything that erodes that is that's something we don't like to see. So like, dream scenario in this outcome is there's access to analytical standards that are correct. So at least the universities can do their thing. I mean, there's enough uncertainty a lot of times in some of the measurements that universities make because it's exploratory and not standardized. The last thing these universities need is like something like that that's just so foundational. Because it also creates a road, you know, if this tactic is successful, every single PFAS manufacturer out there is going to employ the exact same tactics. So, you know, this is definitely like, we need to keep following this story and kind of keep people posted.
And we absolutely will. We just have a quick question here. So is there anything we can do to help things continue to move forward?
To continue to what?
To move forward. I think in terms of like making sure that this doesn't happen, as you just said.
Call your elected officials. Like these are things like, I don't know the details of how, like I don't have like 3 hours digging into this, but like one of the things that would come to mind to me anyway, as someone who has, you know, gotten IP published that was ultimately funded by governments, is if any government funding was used for any step of the development of these chemicals or any of this stuff, like, I mean, the government can go in and exercise a license to patents if it happens in the United States. That's something that is almost never done, but it is an instrument. I just think like public pressure, like if you're looking at the way that PFAS, the trajectory towards the trajectory towards regulation that PFAS is following, it's a steeper slope than any other chemical I've ever seen in my lifetime, certainly anything I've ever worked with. So, I mean, I think it's just really important to keep the pressure, keep applying pressure to elected officials. This is really, really, really important. These chemicals do not break down in the environment, and they are toxic. So, like, if you're in the public, call your elected officials, say that you want to prioritize, you know, that you're in favor of PFAS regulation and tight standards for it.
Yeah.
And just the more noise you can kind of make, the better. So, I mean, we're cheering for these universities because they're kind of that leading edge into doing this. But we want them to have the right tools to make sure that they're laying that solid foundational groundwork.
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, you know, we as citizens have rights and things that we can do, like the Freedom of Information Act. So you can request information. You know, it takes some time, but that's something that we as citizens can do. And then also, we have a right to comment on regulations. I know that this is like only things.
This is really nerdy policy stuff, but like
really
maybe what we should do is like really like once one of these things comes out in a public comment period, you and I just sit down and like show people where it is and like kind of say what our personal beliefs are on it, not as representatives of a company, but as, you know, environmentally minded scientists and policymakers. And then we just kind of like help people out.
Yeah, another quick question. So someone asked, as a newbie, can you briefly describe what effect PFAS has in our water? So if you go back to yesterday's Instagram Live, I did like a whole 20-minute debrief. But, you know, essentially...
In short, yeah, we can just do an in short. It's everywhere. It's it's a class of chemicals that are everywhere. They're toxic and they don't break down. They don't go anywhere. So it's really, really important that we don't pollute with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we're going to sign off. But if you have any questions about this specific legal topic, you can DM us or you can email us at hello@hydroviv.com. And we're going to be watching this pretty closely. So expect to see Instagram Lives in the future or any just information about this on our newsletter. So yeah, make sure that you are kind of staying up to date, and because this ultimately does impact water everywhere. So
absolutely.
With that, thank you so much for joining us, and
have a great day. Have a great Thursday, everyone.
One.
All right.
Okay, bye.